Weight Watchers now offers access to affordable GLP-1s. It works for members like,
I'm Haley, and I've lost 100 pounds. Weight Watchers has everything I need, from weight loss medications to nutrition support and help with my side effects. It's all in one place.
Weight Watchers handles the insurance for you and offers affordable cash pay options. With our program, our members are losing more weight with expert nutrition and side effect support.
I'm Mike, and I've lost 135 pounds. Weight Watchers prescribing GLP-1 medications. It's been life-changing.
I'm Sharia, and I lost 80 pounds on Weight Watchers. I realized that it would take more than a prescription to lose weight and feel good on a GLP-1.
Better results, expert support, lose more weight, make it last.
I can't imagine doing a GLP-1 without Weight Watchers.
Get started for as low as $25 at weightwatchers.com/GLP-1. For over 60 years, we've helped millions of members find what works for them. Now, it's your turn. Weight Watchers. Watch it work.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
The 1992 food pyramid is probably the most recognizable image in the history of public health in America. It's the poster we all remember from our elementary school cafeterias, and it continues to define how we talk about nutrition today. Interestingly, many people treat the pyramid as the current standard, even though it was actually replaced by MyPlate back in 2011. While MyPlate tried to simplify things, the original pyramid remains the shorthand for where we believe our metabolic health went off the rails. The standard story is that the pyramid's low-fat advice is what made the country sick, but the data shows a much more complicated reality. The low-fat marketing of the 90s essentially gave the food industry a green light to flood our environment with hyper-palatable, ultra-processed calories. Since 1977, the average American didn't just change the type of fuel they were using, they added nearly 500 calories to their daily total. We ended up in a health crisis because we followed an engineered environment to a massive calorie surplus. Now, in January 2026, the map has officially been redrawn again. The federal government's 2026 food pyramid, or reset, is a radical departure from everything that came before it. For the first time, we're seeing a protein floor, specifically aimed at increasing dietary protein, and there's an explicit war on ultra-processed foods. At the same time, we're witnessing a populist rebellion that has effectively flipped the pyramid upside down, crowning red meat and butter as health foods while dismissing decades of cardiovascular research. Depending on who you follow, this reset may be predictable out cardiovascular ticking time bomb. Now, Barbell Medicine, we're not interested in the political theater of the reset. We just care about the biology of the people who are going to follow it. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and today we're going behind the curtain of the 2026 guidelines. We're tracking the lobbyist influence, we're dissecting the actual evidence behind these new recommendations, and we're asking if this shift represents a return to real food or a high-stakes gamble on American health. And to help me unpack all of this, we have the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. Now, Austin, when you look at this new inverted pyramid with steak at the top and bread at the point, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Does something different stand out, or does it just take you back to that poster we all had on our elementary school cafeteria walls in the 90s?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, I remember growing up seeing that image on the side of whether cereal boxes or milk cartons or things like that. More recently, I believe it was about maybe 2 years ago or so, there was a South Park episode that actually featured the lab hot take of like, let's take the pyramid and flip it upside down. So this has been foretold as they tend to be quite visionary on that show. Looking at this graphic, I'm honestly not terribly excited about it. I think that much like prior guidelines that people didn't do a great job of following, I'm not sure that they're much more likely to follow these. There's certainly been a lot of hot takes and discourse around these new guidelines at the moment that I know we're going to be getting into today, but those are just some of my initial takes. I don't think it's very likely to have dramatic impacts on people's behavior, which is the main thing that we care about, of course.
Yeah. So I think to understand like how we got here and like its subsequent effects on dietary behaviors and practices, we need to go back. We can't understand why this 2026 reset is happening unless we understand why the 1992 food pyramid, its original inception, was doomed from the very first draft. And so we got to go back to 1980, which is when we published our first dietary guidelines, and the room where it happened. Now, to set the stage here, Senator George McGovern, he had this committee on nutrition and human needs. It was originally formed to end hunger in America, but that committee pivoted towards the rising epidemic of heart disease. Now, to understand why that happened, Eisenhower had a heart attack in office in 1955. Ansel Keys, a researcher, just released his 7 countries study that connected saturated fat intake to heart disease in the 1970s. And so all of this is leading to some pressure about, oh my gosh, we got this epidemic of heart disease. We got to do something about it. And so that committee released a set of dietary goals for the United States in 1977. So predating the first dietary guidelines that were ever widely published. And in those dietary goals, they say to reduce processed sugars by half, so to about 10% of the dietary intake, reduce fat intake to 30% from its current state at 40%, particularly animal fat, reduce that. Reduce saturated fat to less than 10% of daily calories, increase polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, reduce dietary cholesterol intake, reduce sodium intake, and increase fruits and vegetables. That's 1977.
Yeah, and that's, at a time when if you graph out the incidence of cardiovascular disease and in particular cardiovascular disease death, rates were extremely high in the middle of the kind of from 1900 to the year 2000. Like in the early to mid part of that century, the like per capita risk of cardiovascular mortality was extremely high. And so now, even though you still hear us say things like cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the US, leading cause of death worldwide, the overall number of events is still quite high. That is mostly at this point driven by the fact that the population is so much higher. Mm-hmm. But if you correct that per capita, like adjust for the growth of the population, we have made huge progress on the risk of cardiovascular death. Like the sudden death from a heart attack is far less common now compared to where it was, say, in like 1960s. Now people are living with more chronic cardiovascular conditions, things like heart failure and things like that. But it's interesting to see these dietary suggestions. I mean, I think you could quibble about some of them, but overall, it's like, yeah, this would be a net improvement on what it sounds like the diet was before that, even going back to the 70s.
Yeah. So that's 1977. And ultimately that led to the development of the 1980 guidelines. Now, this was a pamphlet. There was no food pyramid at this time. It wasn't like a 400 plus page scientific consensus on, nutrition that we currently get with each iteration of the current guidelines. It was just a little pamphlet. Although, if you want to look at it, I've linked it in the show notes. It looks pretty good. It's very vintage. Mm-hmm. Now, the 1977 sort of guidelines that led to the 1980 pamphlet that was released had been watered down. So effectively, the committee said decrease the consumption of meat, but the cattle industry was pretty chuffed about that. And so the final wording in the 1980 guidelines said, choose meats, poultry, and fish, which will reduce saturated fat intake. So it moved from eat less meat to eat lean meat. The original goal of the 1977 dietary goals was to reduce sugar consumption by 40%. But after heavy lobbying from the sugar industry, the 1980 guidelines were softened to the vague, avoid too much sugar. So there are 2 recurring themes here we're going to see throughout the different iterations of the dietary guidelines, including the current ones. Number 1 is industry influence. That's problem number 1. And 2, vagueness leading to unintended consequences. So we fast forward to 1992. The food pyramid is born. This is the first time that graphic appeared in public. And the reason why they pivoted to this graphic is because, again, we had previously had a pamphlet. Nobody understood them. And so the thought was, well, if we just have a graphic, people will understand that and by and large eat that way. So the USDA hired a nutrition expert named Louise Light to lead the team to develop this graphic. Now, the original food guide and subsequent pyramid looked very different. Light's recommendation was to make the base of the pyramid vegetables and fruits, and grains were a small sliver, like 2 to 4 servings. And they also had to be whole grains. Now, when the draft went up the chain, the grain lobby, represented by the big cereal and flour companies, went to work. They argued that if people only ate 2 servings of grains, the agricultural economy would collapse. And so the USDA overrode the scientists. They flipped the pyramid, put grains at the bottom, and increased the recommendation to a staggering 6 to 11 servings a day. Oh, and by the way, they didn't differentiate between whole grains and refined grains. It was just whatever type of grain, 6 to 11 servings of them per day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's some interesting backstory of what may have happened behind the scenes there. Although, there is some probable distinction between the image and what it conveyed, and to the extent that somebody even used that to kind of inspire their dietary habits or choices, which again, as we'll make the case, most people don't really gravitate towards the use of those tools when making these decisions. If somebody's habitual diet contained, say, 6 servings of whole grains a day, as proper defined by a serving, that is most likely to be completely fine for a large fraction of the population and may even be health promoting or beneficial. But if it is kind of mixed in with or not clearly delineated between refined grains, which, to be clear, even those guidelines were not recommending, like, hey, you should consume up to 11 servings per day, including of refined grains, things like that, then I think you would certainly run into more problems, but that's also not what they were explicitly advising. And so you do hear some more of the kind of conspiratorial minded, which understanding that there is some undercurrent here of like nefarious influence and things like that here and there. But the idea that as a result, the government put forth this clear message of everyone ought to be consuming tons of grains, irrespective of whole grain versus not, is not exactly what those things held even at the time.
Yeah, that certainly wasn't the advice. Although, yeah, you could make an argument, although I don't know a strong one, that people, if they just looked at the graphic, maybe that's what they took away. Or if they just heard eat 6 to 11 servings of grains a day without the, complex caveat, perhaps that might have led to, this dietary pattern. But to me, the real like nefarious undercurrent here is what these guidelines, these 1992 food pyramid and subsequent dietary guidelines sort of incentivized. So while the USDA was telling us what to buy, 2 other giants were figuring out how to make it so we could never stop eating. Now, in one of our previous podcasts on big food, the American pantry was bought by Big Tobacco in the 1980s, and they didn't just bring money, they brought the same scientists who spent decades optimizing nicotine delivery and rate of absorption. They applied that to our food supply. Now, we've evolved as a species to seek calories in order to survive. But these companies turn that survival instinct into profit margins and expanding waistlines for us. So over the last 50 or so years, we didn't get hungrier or subsequently lose willpower as a species, but we did start eating about 500 more calories on average. And this is like a passive overconsumption. Because of these engineered foods, they don't give us the same stop signals as less processed options. And so the thought here is that these ultra-processed foods came into prominence due to market pressures. The food pyramid had this base of grains, and to keep them shelf stable and cost efficient, industry leaned into refined flours and starches and away from whole grains. And also we had this advice to reduce fat. That was everywhere. So the food industry capitalized and made more of their foods low fat or fat free to get the healthy label and the fat free or low fat label. But to maintain taste and texture, mouthfeel, etc., they added sugar, sodium, and other additives, which ultimately reduced satiety or feeling of fullness and added some calories. Now, ultra-processed foods make up about 70% of the U.S. food supply. And between 1977 and the early 2000s, the average American didn't just get hungrier, we got hacked. We're eating way more calories. So to me, it's easy to look back at 1992 and the food pyramid and blame the lobbyists, but the scientific community wasn't silent at the time. When the USDA was printing millions of these posters, researchers at Harvard, led by Walter Willett, he's the same guy who came up with the Eat Lancet diet, which is pretty good, sounding the alarm. They pointed out that there was a fundamental flaw in the pyramid's design. The pyramid created all carbohydrates as equal, and biologically speaking, it didn't distinguish between a Cheerio and a steel-cut oat. Now, if you read the fine print, if you read the scientific consensus, it says, oh, no, we want complex carbohydrates, but that's not what the graphic really showed. So, Austin, as we look at this new food pyramid called the 2026 Reset with its protein floors and the inversion of the old food pyramid, I'm starting to hear some very similar sounding alarms from the scientific community. Do you think we're finally getting it right, or are we watching history repeat itself once again by failing to heed the warnings of experts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think that we are, with this revision, getting closer to truth. I think it is a spectacle. In particular, if you look at the fact that, this heavily criticized 1992 food pyramid is now getting inverted. There's like something intrinsically symbolic and provocative about that, right? It's about the spectacle and kind of the show of, you've been lied to and we're flipping everything on its head and things like that. Of course, as we and others have pointed out many times, the food pyramid hasn't been used for well over a decade, quite a bit longer. There was this intermediate, evolution that happened, the My Plate system that did not actually rely on the food pyramid, nor did it continue to reflect that like broad base of indiscriminate grain, maybe implications graphically, even though, again, the text did not advise people consume that much of like processed or non complex carbohydrate sources and things like that. So I do think that there's almost more of an emphasis on like making this a spectacle, and it's almost performative in a sense, without being a thing that is likely to either radically, transform behavior or be much more accurate than existing guidelines that we've had. If anything, I've seen a fair amount of criticism that these actually make certain things more ambiguous, more nebulous, more controversial, especially from the scientific perspective. But at the same time, that's not too surprising. Once you get a sense of like how these guidelines actually get drafted, there is the scientific committee of experts and who are extremely familiar with the literature, and they put an enormous amount of time and effort into formulating their scientific consensus. But from there, for that consensus to get translated into the actual guidelines and then subsequently into policy, there's an additional layer of filtering that happens. And that happens through HHS as well as the USDA. And that's what's kind of tricky here is when you think about the USDA, Department of Agriculture, it's like, well, are they charged fundamentally with a primary interest in promoting the health of Americans, or are they charged with a mandate relating to agriculture in the United States? And so there's almost like an intrinsic conflict of interest there that makes things complicated and a little bit problematic that they are significantly involved in this process at all. It's not to say that just the scientists would do a phenomenal job of being able to formulate guidelines, because even though scientists are great at sciencing and at coming up with committee statements, they are not great oftentimes at public communication. And so I shudder to think about what the product might look like if it was just left up to, the scientists to come up with a very compelling kind of public message on this. I think you do need some level of additional, skill, filter, interpretation there. But the actual process that this goes through, that's why you see, for example, some of that softening of language that you described, where the scientific committee and consensus might explicitly advise certain things, for example, say to, reducing red meat intake or something like that. Whereas after it goes through that USDA filter and things like that, you might end up with that softening of language or making things a little bit more vague, a little bit more permissive. And then it leads to less clear, less concrete guidelines in the end that are often less compatible with the current scientific consensus as established by the original committee. So that's kind of what I see this evolution as. It's almost more performative and for show than it is something that is like more closely approximating truth that is likely to materially advance the health of our population.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like the USDA is in a conflicted spot, to say the least. It's kind of like the same company that's charged with reducing lung cancer rates in America is also selling you cigarettes. And you're like, I don't understand what your primary interest is. What's your major incentive? So yeah, some maybe predictable outcomes in a way as far as like softening language, in addition to just science communicators getting a hold of this and saying, look, we can't talk about the polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio in technical terms, but maybe we can just say reduce saturated fat, for example. That previously was in the guidelines. But the way I want to come at the 2026 food pyramid, the updated guidelines, is through this cinematic reference with Clint Eastwood at the helm. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to start off with the good. And for me, there are two major victories: increased protein and the acknowledgement that ultra-processed foods are a problem. So let's start out with protein. For years, the RDA for protein was set at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. This is a number designed simply to prevent nitrogen deficiency in a otherwise inactive person. So this 2026 reset, the new food pyramid, finally established what they're calling a protein floor of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day for adults. Dr. Lehman was one of the advisors there, and he's one of the best there is in this space. So it seems like they're keeping up with the evidence. So on paper, yeah, raising the protein recommendation to 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day seems like a massive victory for supporting muscular health, particularly in adults who are lifting weights or exercising, and older adults who are at risk of sarcopenia. So you can think about like protein as a building block. You know, if you're building a skyscraper that is constantly under renovation, the old guidelines were like sending a brick, one truck of bricks per week, just enough to keep the building from being condemned and falling down. But if you're actually living in that building or trying to renovate it through resistance training, you're going to need more bricks. You're going to need a constant convoy of delivery trucks to keep up with the pace of construction. So the new guidelines could theoretically increase the supply of bricks or building blocks, making the renovation process easier and more successful. However, there's a catch here. The recommendation as it sits probably doesn't make that much of a difference, not just because people don't read the guidelines or follow them, which we'll get to, but because it's not that much different than the current protein intake amongst most adults in the United States. Most adults eat way more protein than the RDA. In the US, the typical adult consumes about 1.07 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. Now, obviously, there is variation there. Some people eat way less, some people eat way more. So between you and I, we're probably bringing up the average, and other people are bringing down the average. So to me, it's kind of like a paper recommendation. It's like, well, look, it is higher, but like, I don't know how much it would actually change if people were just meeting the numbers. Perhaps the good that comes out of this is, with this emphasis on eating more protein, potentially that extra protein could displace other foods that were, ultra processed foods or otherwise high calories that drove that 500 calorie surplus that we've talked about in the last episode and now this episode. That's all theoretical, but I guess we could count this as a win. What do you think about the new protein recommendations, specifically with respect to like health outcomes such as sarcopenia, frailty, and so on? Is this a good move or not?
Yeah, I would push back a little bit on the idea on narrowing the scope to sarcopenia and frailty, because that's not what these guidelines are for, right? These guidelines are general dietary guidelines for Americans. And probably one area in my own thinking as far as nutritional guidelines has gone over the years is softening definitely what I would consider in terms of protein recommendations for the general public. I think that if, a lot of people are hanging around 1.2, that's already probably more than enough for most folks. We know, or we at least feel relatively confident, that higher levels than that among training populations or those who are very anabolically resistant may confer some additional benefit. I think, as with most things, there tends to be pretty significantly diminishing returns to that. And so pushing the whole population to try to hit 1.6 when we think that there are pretty substantially diminishing returns as you approach that level, and certainly if you exceed it, I don't know that that's going to be making a huge difference in population health. Even when it comes to people with sarcopenia, their fundamental issue way more often tends to be some combination of disuse atrophy, in other words, insufficient physical activity, they're not training, and maybe they have advanced medical conditions that are also contributing to it that could maybe be better managed, but maybe not, right? It's really hard to get big and strong and jacked when you have advanced Parkinson's disease or heart failure, COPD, cirrhosis, cancer, things like that. When it comes to management of sarcopenia and frailty, I am much, much, much more strongly in favor of getting people active and training. Compared with jacking up their protein intake, I think is much less likely to have a big, big impact on their health outcomes. So ultimately, I'm kind of a shrug in this. It's like my, in years past, my, very barbell training oriented self would have been strongly in favor, but that's also limited to that context of somebody who wants to get the biggest outcomes out of their training. Yeah, you can probably benefit by pushing it up to that, say 1.6, in certain situations, even higher. But when I'm saying, this is for the entire country, whether you're training, not training, young, old, sarcopenia, not, I'd be fine with just like calling it 1.2 and saying most of the population on average is about there. And if somebody is clearly eating a nutritionally depleted diet or a nutrient deficient diet, then yeah, we want to get them up to that level. But calling 1.6 a floor for the population, I would actually not be in favor of that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let me pose a would you rather to you. All right. So let's just say, by sheer publicity and, fanfare around the new inverted food pyramid, there's a 10% section of the population that now has increased their dietary protein intake, right? So that's scenario 1. 10% of the population jacks up their protein to 1.6. Now, to be clear, neither of us are saying like, look, if you go above that much or at that level and you don't lift, like bad things are going to happen to you. It's just like,
Sure.
you're probably not seeing benefits. All right, so that's scenario 1. Or you take the same portion of the population, 10%, is currently not exercising, and instead they start meeting the physical activity guidelines to include conditioning and lifting weights. Which do you predict would have a greater impact on health outcomes?
Absolutely, no question. The latter. Getting that portion of the population more active is going to have a way bigger impact than bumping up their protein intake.
Yeah. So I'm trying to be charitable to these guidelines because I don't want to be like, look, they're all bad, because that's not necessarily the case. In fact, they're not really that changed comparatively. Just some weird kind of nuances they decided to pick that are seemingly at odds with the current scientific consensus. But look, if increasing protein or the advertisement that's in the guidelines convinces somebody to read the guidelines, great. What I think they missed an opportunity to do is say, and by the way, this would be maximally leveraged if you lifted some weights, and you should do that.
Sure.
Okay. So if we're calling that a win, which sure, if people chose to increase their protein intake and, that led to increased exercise or displacement of other foods that are higher calorie, that's probably a win. But for most folks, maybe shoulder shrug emoji.
Yeah.
The second win here, which I actually think is maybe a bigger win, is we've announced an official war on ultra processed foods. So like for the first time, seemingly, a federal document explicitly identifies highly processed foods as a primary driver of chronic disease, right alongside physical inactivity. That's right in the opening page of this. And they're not just blaming sugar, they're looking at the food matrix. They recommend avoiding ultra-processed foods. They also give a little decoder ring type thing. They're like, look, avoid foods if they've got some syrup in there, or it ends with OSE, like OS, like it's a glucose or something like that, for added sugars. And to their credit, they don't mention Nova a single time in these guidelines. That's just this classification of food processing. Now, this is also in the scientific consensus. If you read that, it's a 400-something page document. They talk about how ultra-processed foods may lead to poor health through food matrix disruption. One of these things is like bioavailability. So industrial processing breaks down the physical structure of food. That's the matrix, which can make nutrients like starch and sugar absorbed much faster by the body, potentially leading to not only higher glycemic responses, but also overconsumption, basically cutting the brake lines. There's no stop signal here. Overconsumption, higher calorie intake. We talked about that on the last podcast. So got to give it some credit here. They also don't condemn functionally processed foods. So things like Greek yogurt, for example, or frozen fruits or vegetables, which are technically processed, but yeah, they don't call those out, which is nice. So I don't know. I view that as sort of a win. As far as implementation, I have my skepticism there. But yeah, what do you think about that? Because it's the first time I've seen that in dietary guidelines, other than to say like, avoid refined carbohydrates. But that's usually packed in the consensus and not like the actual document that people might read.
Added sugars has been a appropriately demonized thing, I think, for a fair amount of time. The problem with the processing conversation, as you've alluded to here and we've talked about before, is just one of definitions. And certainly if it's going to come to policy, because policy requires definitions. And there, to date, remains a lack of a clear consensus definition on what is a processed or an ultra processed food that is neat and tidy and does not have some combination of both false positives and false negatives in terms of foods that we would all recognize as not being ideal for health that fail to meet certain criteria, and others that clearly, as you mentioned, like Greek yogurt, for example, that are maybe technically processed in some ways that might otherwise meet certain criteria even though it shouldn't be. So it's problematic, and I think that having clear definitions on this is going to be needed for anyone to be able to actually implement policy, especially knowing that, or feeling confident that, hey, if this pisses off the wrong person, there's going to be legal challenges, and then you're just in a whole mess at that point.
Yeah. I was trying to predict like what, if any, sort of industry influence that this document and would maybe have. Right, kind of similar to what happened in the 90s when the food pyramid came out, and they were like, look, we got to be low fat, and the base of the pyramid is grains, and so we need to make these affordable. So some unintended consequences there. What are the unintended consequences here? I can't think of anything that comes from these, maybe the good side of the guidelines. So now it's time to get into the bad. there are some things in here that have a lot of scientists and clinicians, including us, deeply concerned. And so, we spent the last 20 something minutes talking about, how these guidelines respect the biology of the gut and the muscle. But while fixing the metabolic engine, the guidelines might have decided to ignore the plumbing. So the guidelines still recommend keeping saturated fats under 10% of total calories. It's actually in the little pamphlet. It's also in the scientific consensus. And they acknowledge that 82% of Americans already exceed this and that there are no biological requirements for saturated fat intake. Yet the messaging here is complicated because they're saying, oh yeah, you can use things like butter and beef tallow and eat more red meat. And to me, that is crazy. Austin, when you saw that the guidelines recommended butter and beef tallow as well as leaning into animal-based proteins, what was your immediate reaction? Are we finally freeing the public from the failed lipid heart hypothesis, or are we watching like a populist rebellion walk us right into the cardiovascular dead end?
So I think that this is going to be an area where some people inevitably are going to just have strong opinions and disagree. I just fundamentally don't think that we have been dealing with a failed hypothesis of heart disease. Again, if you look at the actual statistics on risk of cardiovascular death, it has been steadily dropping. It's actually plateaued in the last few years, but over the course of the last 70 years, we have managed to put a huge dent into the risk of cardiovascular death through combinations of things. I will recognize combinations of less smoking, better blood pressure control, lipid lowering therapies, better treatments of acute heart attacks so they're less likely to kill people immediately and things like that. But when we survey the entire body of evidence on nutritional interventions, including, highly tightly controlled metabolic ward studies and things like that, there is overall a relatively consistent directionality to it. And we have not been just like steadily marching in the opposite direction up until this point where they've like inverted things and set the course more correct. So part of my problem with this is that it's just kind of incoherent in the sense that if you're advising people to crank up the butter and beef tallow, yet also to keep their saturated fat intake less than 10% of calories, that's quite challenging. Right? Meeting that guideline is going to necessarily require you to opt for generally quite lean sources of protein if you're going to be relying on animal-derived sources. If you end up going with fish or other things, then that's great, and that's arguably even better in a lot of ways. But it's just, if you think that guidelines drive behavior, right? And so that's one of my challenges to folks in this space is you claimed that the old guidelines caused the obesity epidemic. Now we have these new guidelines that you are a big fan of, and I should expect will fix the obesity epidemic. Please set some explicit outcomes that you will be looking for. What will you be measuring? What time point do you expect this to happen by? And then we will assess at that time point. The caveat will be we need to make sure that the outcomes that we observe are not better explained by the use of GLP-1 agonists.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? That's been my hot take to this point is if you think this is going to radically improve outcomes, for example, when it relates to heart disease risk, show me your predicted outcome and what you're looking for. Basically, pre-register your hypothesis. That's like a fundamentally scientific principle, right? That's how a lot of studies, when they get pre-registered, it says, here's our hypothesis, here's what we think is going to happen. And you say in advance, if this happens, our hypothesis will be supported. If this happens, well, I'll have to reject my hypothesis. The problem is that people don't operate this way. People who are fans of beef tallow are going to be fans of beef tallow no matter what happens over the long term, no matter what I say, no matter what you say. That's just the tough thing here. But my issue, again, is just the incoherence of it. And the fact that I don't think that most people are going to be able to, even if they wanted to use these guidelines, design a coherent diet that leans into butter, beef tallow, and high intakes of red meat while also meeting the 10% saturated fat guideline. One of those things is going to fail.
Yeah, I agree. And it is interesting. This is like the start of the disconnect between the scientific consensus, again, this 400-page review of the current evidence to date by a panel of experts, right? Many experts and millions of dollars spent to do that. They acknowledge that, look, the primary contributors of saturated fat in the current American diet are burgers and sandwiches, desserts and sweet snacks, and other mixed dishes. And they also acknowledge that reducing butter, red meat, whether it's processed or unprocessed, and replacing them with plant-based sources, that lowers cardiovascular disease risk. You should encourage beans, peas, lentils, etc., and monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. And, they go through all this evidence, right? So they're saying on one hand, like, we should probably reduce beef tallow, butter intake, and red meat intake, just generally speaking, and shifting towards this other type of dietary pattern. The pyramid is like, nah, dog, I got this, watch. Instead of like making a case for why using beef tallow and butter would be health promoting, it seems like an add-on. Like the rest of that whole section reads very similar to the consensus, which is like, yeah, we should probably avoid this stuff, limit saturated fat, choose these other options. And instead they're like, no, but you can also have beef tallow and butter. It's like, to your point, incoherent, because like, how do you square that,
Yeah, I think that this is the result of what we'll call post-processing. After emerging from the scientific committee, the post-processing of this by the subsequent actors in this space who have, certain biases and preferences and motivated reasoning, and they like, beef and steak and, aggression and manliness and things like that, all these kind of ideas that they want to bake into their guidelines as part of this whole kind of performative, thing for spectacle. That's my perspective on it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another interesting kind of wrinkle here. It's like this dairy hall pass. Because the committee found some moderate evidence that substituting red meat for dairy reduces heart disease risk. But it seemingly made its way to the new food pyramid in a very interesting way by pushing full-fat dairy, specifically whole milk and cheese. I got a big concern that this may increase calorie density unnecessarily without significantly improving satiety markers, so just how full people get. Like, are people just going to eat way more calories? And also, full fat dairy can be more rewarding than lower fat options. So we both know that the literature on full fat dairy is pretty messy. There's just a ton of confounding variables. So like socioeconomic status, who buys low fat or fat free dairy, who consumes whole fat dairy, and more. Still, though, when the food pyramid tells people to go full fat for dairy, are they ignoring the fact that whole milk essentially provides a high reward potential calorie bomb that might exacerbate the 500 calorie surplus that we're trying to fix?
I think it's a maybe. This is something that's like, I'm open to seeing kind of what happens. I don't think people are going to use these guidelines for their behaviors. They're going to pick what they pick, regardless of what these things advise. But there may be some sort of like cultural shift. I fully recognize, like when we were growing up, that things were definitely leaning towards the skim milk direction more heavily. And so if there's a broader shift in the public conception, then yeah, that might impact behavior. You're right that there's going to be an energy, overall calorie impact on that. The dairy whole topic is pretty interesting. We've talked before about how most forms of dairy, including full fat forms, with the exception of butter, don't actually tend to be especially harmful in the context of, say, blood lipids and cardiovascular disease and things like that, whereas the churning process that turns it into butter has some impact on the chemical composition, and then that has some downstream impacts that are kind of net harmful on blood lipids and cardiovascular risk. So we'll have to see what happens on that front, but I agree there's a non-significant difference in calorie density, which seems to be a pretty major problem that we're trying to deal with. The reward aspect, no doubt that drinking a glass of whole milk is pretty thick and rich and heavy and tasty when it goes into a milkshake, much more so than skim. You also wonder, to the extent that a person is sensitive to satiety signals, is there some kind of compensatory effect? We know that doesn't tend to happen with other forms of like liquid calories. Mm-hmm. Does it happen a bit more with milk? Maybe. I have less strong opinions about this in general compared with some of the other areas of the guidelines, though. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if they said, look, dairy's generally good, I'd be like, yeah, I agree. but the idea of pushing the full fat variety in particular seems, I'm just like, why? Like, my prediction is that you would either have a neutral effect on body weight management or a negative one, not likely a positive. That seems highly improbable to me. I think also, recognizing that it's seemingly dairy, sans butter, seems to be pretty neutral or perhaps even beneficial on blood lipids. Yeah, I'm all for dairy. Let's do it. But I just think explicitly trying to recommend full fat versions, it just doesn't really make sense to me. I think it's almost like the pendulum swung too far the other way. It's like, look, we've been doing low fat, fat free, and a majority of the low fat, fat free products that were, designed in the 90s ended up having added sugars and stuff like that. I think most people who are in this space would say, yeah, that was bad. Generally not good. People overeat those things. But I don't think we have to apply that specifically to dairy. And, we have hopefully functioning synapses and can discern between two different cases. And you would have hoped for better considering how many people are, taking in this information. But it's the start of the year, which means that many of you are setting big goals. But you're likely realizing that your schedule has not gotten any less busy. Now, if you're trying to manage your nutrition, but you have zero time to shop, prep, or cook, Factor makes it easy. They provide fully prepared meals designed by dietitians and crafted by chefs that you can eat well without the typical friction of meal prep. The nutrition profile here is solid. We're talking about quality ingredients, including lean proteins, colorful vegetables, and healthy fats. Now, whether your goal is general health, weight management, or performance, the meals are designed to support you and your fitness journey. They've got over 100 rotating weekly meals, including options for high protein, a calorie deficit or surplus, a Mediterranean diet, or even a plant-based dietary pattern. Whatever your preferences are, Factor has you covered. And when I'm busy working, I don't want to spend a ton of time in the kitchen, and Factor comes in clutch to help keep me on track. They're always fresh, never frozen, and a meal's ready in about 2 minutes. I get the quality of a home-cooked meal without the stress. Now, if your schedule is busy like mine, I think Factor could be a big help in 2026. Head over to factormeals.com/BBM50off and use code BBM50off to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. The offer is only valid for new Factor customers with the code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchases. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. That's factormeals.com/BBM50off. New year, colder days, this is the moment where your winter wardrobe actually has to deliver some measurable results. Quince brings together premium materials and enduring quality so that you stay warm and you look sharp all season long. I look at clothing like a training program. I want high utility and zero waste. Usually, luxury gear has a massive markup that doesn't actually correlate to quality, at least not all of the time. But Quince cuts out the middleman to deliver luxury materials like cashmere, wool, and Italian leather, all at a fraction of the price. Now, their outerwear is particularly impressive. From down jackets to wool coats, everything is made by trusted factories with rigorous ethical standards. I've been wearing some of their cashmere sweaters lately because the holiday party round, Now they're soft, they're durable, and they're holding up better than brands that cost 3 times as much. I didn't have to drop a fortune on them, and their style actually holds up year after year. Refresh your winter wardrobe at quince.com/BBM for free shipping and 365-day returns. They're now in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/BBM. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/BBM.
The new Wegovy pill is now available through Weight Watchers. Powerful GLP-1 results in a simple pill at the lowest price available. And with Weight Watchers, you can get doctor support and personalized nutrition programs. See if you qualify at weightwatchers.com. Ad not reviewed or approved by Novo Nordisk.
And again, nothing surprises me anymore.
Yeah.
And finally, I suspect you won't care about this, but we're going to see. Once again, the guidelines do not mention anything about dietary cholesterol. Now, I didn't expect them to mention the P to S ratio. That's just the ratio of polyunsaturated fat intake to saturated fat intake. But dietary cholesterol is still like a hot button. People, again, if we're talking about a dietary pendulum, before it was like minimize dietary cholesterol intake. And then it was like, nah, it doesn't matter. Cholesterol is more complicated, which is true. But there's some nuance there. So we've covered this before, I believe a podcast episode called 5 Nutrition Controversies. Science tells us that the impact of saturated fat intake and dietary cholesterol, doesn't happen in a vacuum. If your ratio is high, meaning that you're taking in a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids and dietary fiber, your body tends to handle the dietary cholesterol pretty well. Blood lipoproteins like LDL don't seem to change much in response, but the typical Western diet or standard American diet, which to be clear is different than the guidelines. When people say the standard American diet, they're not referring to guidelines type dietary patterns. It's just what people normally eat. Well, that P to S ratio is really low, mainly because we consume a lot of saturated fat relative to polyunsaturated fat. The current ratio is about 0.5, and we're really aiming for 1 or even 2. But when that ratio is low, dietary cholesterol can increase blood lipids quite a bit. And now, with the recommendation that beef tallow and butter are fine, this could be an even bigger problem without any comment on dietary cholesterol. Austin, what do you think? Is the, no mentioning of dietary cholesterol a big issue, or are you just like, well, look, no one reads the guidelines anyway and no one would care, so it's fine?
I do feel like I keep coming back to saying nobody's been reading these or acting upon them, and I do continue to stand by that. My issue with, the idea that maybe we should have mentioned something like that is also a broader concern about how guidelines should be communicated to the public. Should it be, on one hand, in terms of foods, Or should it, on the other hand, be in terms of nutrients? So when you tell a person or the general population, who you should assume are not highly educated in this space, that you should consume less saturated fat, that is completely meaningless to people out there, right? So that is a nutrient-based, dietary recommendation that, nerds, bodybuilding bros, scientists, we understand, but the general population does not operate on a kind of nutrient-based model of diet, of nutrition. That is not where their understanding comes from. And so I don't think that public health dietary guidelines should be rooted in, nutrient-based communication to say things like sodium or saturated fat or cholesterol or P to S ratios or things like that. But rather, it should be fundamentally, I think, food-based. So eat more of these foods, eat less of these foods, ideally eliminate these foods. Part of the problem, though, is even if the scientific committee were to establish statements like that in their statement to say that these foods should be prioritized, these should be reduced, these should be eliminated, there's still, again, that subsequent layer of filtering that these go through before they're communicated to the public, where various actors and industry influence and USDA and things like that have an opportunity to either soften some of that language or shift it actually to some of this nutrient-based labeling or kind of recommendations that kind of give them more space to operate here. So it makes it so that, for example, food industry might then be able to reformulate their food product to meet something that is more nutrient-based while still being a food that probably shouldn't be eating, right? Or they might give them kind of a little bit longer leash to operate in that space compared with if it was just like, hey, probably shouldn't eat this food. Yeah, that might have a more dramatic impact on their bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if I had my druthers, the phrase that you love, that I say, there are like various pages in this food pyramid. And, it'll start out with like energy, and then it goes to protein, and then it goes to fruits and vegetables. And so to your point, I agree. The majority of what's on that page should be eat this, eat more of this, eat less of that. And then it should ideally be accessible for most people, whether high income, low income, and everything in between. I would prefer that at the top of that page or the very first bullet point to have some sort of like, maybe not science sounding, but like just discrete statement. So for example, in the fat section, we should limit saturated fatty acid intake. Eat more of these foods, eat less of these foods. And here are some like fringe cases, mainly to like make it clear. And ultimately you're trying to increase the skill set of the people who are consuming this information of navigating a label in our current environment, or at least just having some fund of knowledge stuff. So where they could like assess something that's not immediately clear to them. Like, well, this has a high amount of saturated fat. The food guidelines didn't say anything about saturated fat, so I'm kind of like up a creek. I mean, obviously that's a relatively rare case. The person read the food pyramid and the guideline, and then they're ultimately making having this question. Yeah, that's just in my perfect world. That's how it would look like.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable take. The art of public health communication is complex, and there's a lot of those implicit decisions that need to be made, and it can be challenging if you don't have active knowledge or expertise in this space, because you might be like, well, I understand this stuff really well, and here's how I would communicate it, and that might not land at all with the person in front of you or with the broader public.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to know how this was like workshopped. Like they had a focus group after focus group after focus group. And at the end, the focus group is like, we get it. Beef tallow. I'm taking a bath in it.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about the good. We've talked about the bad. And now we got to talk about the ugly. We went into the weeds of lipidology, talking about all sorts of stuff related to P to S ratio, saturated fat, etc. But maybe there's a hidden cost to this saturated fat endorsement that goes beyond the cholesterol panel. When the cultural narrative shifts so aggressively towards red meat and animal fats, it could create a retreat from plant-based foods. Now, we know that meat has exactly 0 grams of dietary fiber. And we also know that only 6% of Americans currently meet the recommended intake for dietary fiber. By prioritizing meat for protein, the guidelines could be contributing to a massive fiber intake delta. And this may be like a sort of substitution trap. In 1992, the original food pyramid, we substituted fat for refined grains. In the new guidelines, we seem to be encouraging people to ignore great sources of fiber that were prominent in the previous guidelines, like beans, peas, lentils, etc., and instead choose more calorie-dense, 0-fiber animal proteins. Austin, are we watching the government repeat the exact same mistake of 1992, where they focused so hard on one variable, protein, that they inadvertently create a whole new public health crisis in the form of a 25 gram per day fiber gap?
I don't know that they're going to be creating a new public health crisis as a result of a fiber, insufficient fiber intake, because most people are already consuming insufficient amounts of this fiber in their diet. There would be, certainly a strong case to be made for potential health benefits by significantly increasing that intake from a variety of plant-based food sources. And I would say that reflects probably the most substantial change in like my own habitual dietary pattern in recent years, yours as well to some extent. More strongly leaning into a lot more plant-based sources of all sorts of nutrients, including protein and fiber and things like that, just based on our understanding of the evidence and kind of where it's been. And these are not actually based on new findings either, but just kind of becoming more familiar with this whole body of evidence. So I don't know that these guidelines represent a clear shift away from high fiber foods, more so like insufficient prioritization of those that would represent good sources of dietary fiber, because they're not recommending against the consumption, for example, of legumes or lentils. But if you look, it's like it might be implied that they're not, placed as high on the this inverted pyramid now, with the base being at the top, oddly. And so this is in the face of pretty abundant available evidence that we have in terms of food substitutions, that substituting, super fatty cuts of meat for some of these plant-derived food sources has a host of health benefits on people. And they, in fact, do not become acutely protein deficient or chronically protein deficient by making such a substitution. A lot of things stand to improve. So again, fundamentally, people aren't reading or listening or paying attention to the guidelines to make their decisions. If they were, I still don't know that this is going to be like, open up this new health crisis as a result of poor fiber intake, because most people aren't consuming enough anyway. Would I prefer, and I think you would as well, that the shift and the nudge and the encouragement have gone in the other direction of, more people would stand to benefit from the inclusion of these foods on a regular basis in their diets, recognizing that like legumes are honestly, super culturally prominent in some parts of the world and not terribly so in the US. And we would actually stand to benefit by, increasing their prevalence in our habitual diets for a lot of reasons. Yeah, I think we would both prefer that for a lot of potential health benefits. That's not the way that they went. My pre-registered hypothesis here is that choice is unlikely to, make a hugely deleterious impact. Just as I would predict that if they had emphasized it more, I'm still not sure it would have had a hugely beneficial impact either.
Yeah. You imagine though, so they bump the protein intake up, right? And let's say they made this pyramid, and where that steak and that cheese nugget and the chicken, it's just a big bean instead. They're like, look, we want you to eat more protein, primarily by increasing your legume intake. Like,
eat more edamame. Yeah.
You're taking a subgroup of vegetables and you're combining into a subgroup for protein foods, and like ultimately the increase in fiber would be generally good. Did you ever watch the Netflix series Travelers? The Travelers?
No.
All right. So, no spoilers here on the Barbell Medicine podcast. We don't do any spoiling. But basically these people from the future come back and they try to prevent the end of the world. Right. And they're like, yeah, standard story, and something I would definitely watch. You would like this series. Interestingly, they're all vegans in the future, and they come back, and the idea, they look around, there's one scene, they're looking around, everyone's eating meat, and they're like,
this is barbarians.
Yeah. But I think that kind of like touches on just most people who go down this, health, fitness, wellness sort of rabbit hole, particularly with formal education and, review of the evidence. You tend to shift towards having more plant-based food in your diet. It doesn't mean you necessarily switch to a vegetarian or vegan, but you include more because it's overwhelming. You just can't ignore it. Like even with I'm good at rationalizing. I am excellent at it, but I cannot rationalize away all of that evidence. And so, yeah, that would have been interesting if the food pyramid is like, yeah, we flipped it upside down. Now it looks like a piece of pizza, but the top corner, there's this huge bean. It's like,
yeah,
that would have been interesting. So also this ignores anything about like planetary health, which we are not experts in, but like to the extent that this changes that at all, some concerns there. All right. So we're still in the ugly section here. There's some non-nutritive sweetener hate here, why? I think, there are issues with the evidence on non-nutritive sweeteners, mainly because when you look at it by and large, they do not discriminate between where those non-nutritive sweeteners are coming from. Meaning, like, there are many ultra-processed foods that, again, low, not very filling, high in calories, contain a bunch of stuff that you probably don't want. You're going, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to eat too much of it, that have non-nutritive sweeteners in there, artificial sweeteners or naturally occurring sweeteners that still don't have any calories. And so if you compare somebody who's eating a lot of those to somebody who's eating none of those, you're like, see, non-nutritive sweeteners, terrible for you. Instead, if you just restrict your analysis to people that are eating foods with added sugars or consuming drinks, sugar-sweetened beverages being the most prominent, they're replacing those with non-nutritive sweetened beverages, there's an improvement. And so it just seemed weird. Like, again, this is a pretty short document. Why even waste the text on this? There's so many other things. Like, it just seemed like a weird kind of line in the sand to draw and like not accurate also.
Yeah, I think, anybody who's taking an honest look at the overall body of evidence and about these in particular, but also about like the state of public health in general, is going to have a hard time making a case that the use of non-nutritive sweeteners in general, or any one of them in particular, is like contributing to a large fraction of like public morbidity or premature mortality or something like that. So I agree. I wouldn't waste my time worrying about these.
Yeah, in fact, I would have done the opposite. More Diet Cokes.
Sure.
Like, yeah, let's do it. Then this other weird thing that falls definitively in the ugly sort of category. There's this retreat on alcohol. It went from 2 drinks for men, 1 drink for women, which admittedly is not great because, like, what is a drink? There was no like, this is a standard drink, but whatever, guidelines. And now it's to a vague consume less, because apparently it's a social lubricant. While the less is better, that's certainly true. This shift towards vagueness is like a classic policy pivot. It's lip service that avoids holding the industry accountable while leaving the consumer without a concrete target. Just less. Again, I would prefer it say, like, generally speaking, alcohol is not health promoting. As little as possible. Like, that'd be fine. It'd probably, anger some people that probably contribute to the development of these guidelines, but it would also have the benefit of being accurate. And also Dr. Oz wouldn't be like a meme right now. So
bizarre. Yeah. It's honestly, it's like, what is your job? What are you being asked to do? What are you charged with? You are not here to be the secretary of social lubrication. I'll say that, right?
Nice.
If you were, then that would be your primary charge of finding all the things that confer that supposed benefit, almost independent of their potential risks. And then you can state your case and you can be part of a committee. And you're like, well, I'm here, from the standpoint of social lubrication, and here's a beneficial thing. And then you can debate with people from the other side who are just like, nah, but it also leads to increased risk of all sorts of downstream health consequences and problems. And then you can hash it out and see which, has the greater net benefit or net harm, which I think is not a controversial thing for anybody taking an honest look at these. So this is just an example of that kind of, going from the scientific committee level to the post-processing, the filtering, how language can get weakened and massaged a little bit based on the stakeholders and who's involved in that decision-making, to make these guidelines ultimately a bit impotent by the end, just to, less. It's like, yeah, a lot of people get told that they should probably drink less. This is often not news to them in many of these situations. But that's not the purpose of these guidelines, and nor are the guidelines intended to help socialize the population.
Yeah. Look, if there's a department for social lubrication, I'm signing up.
You're here for it? Okay.
Well, I'm here for that and Space Force. Like, if I'm signing up for both. All right. So the other ugly part, and perhaps the most interesting to you, Dr. Baraki, is the uptake and the potential for that. So first off, what do these guidelines actually do? And most people think that these guidelines are just a pamphlet for doctors' offices or something to like post up in the school cafeteria. But in reality, they are the budgeting blueprint for billions of dollars in annual federal spending. So we got the National School Lunch Program, 30 million children, feeds every day. You got the WIC program. You've got SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, military rations, and VA hospitals. This could theoretically affect a lot of actual meals going in actual bodies every day. To the extent this changes, so now like all of the French fries served in the school cafeteria are they're, from tallow. Like, what? Or like, you can't get diet soda anymore because non-nutritive sweeteners generally bad. Like, again, what? some of this is hyperbole, but it's like the same amount of hyperbole from the other side of the coin. I shudder to think what these changes would actually have on the national school lunch program, because if the current budget is X, right, you get this amount of money, and now protein's got to go up specifically from animal sources, which are generally more expensive. Oh, by the way, no non-nutritive sweeteners. Can't use any of those. And we're going to cook in beef tallow and butter. And it's like, so it's gotten way more expensive and like less health promoting. Doesn't seem like a win to me.
I'm going to come back to my hot take from earlier. Tell me what outcome you're hoping to impact by making this change, right? Here's the outcome that I'm looking for. Here's what I expect is going to happen. Here's how long I expect it's going to take for this to manifest wholesale, right? I expect to see, children's health improve in this way. I want to see children's blood pressure come down, their BMIs or their kind of growth charts that they'll fall back onto a healthy part of the growth chart. Childhood obesity will go down. These are all the things that I'm expecting will happen as a result of me switching to cooking fries and beef tallow and these other sorts of things in schools. If that happens by this date, that will reinforce my hypothesis. I'll pat myself on the back and we'll carry on. Okay. If it does not happen, I will be forced to reject my hypothesis, and we will alter the plan, go in a different direction, test an alternative hypothesis, or revert back to what we were doing before. They won't do that. Nope. People will not pre-register their hypothesis like this. But that would be how I would charge them with these kind of things. If they are put into positions of power with the ability to impact these policies, then that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah. And that's just like federally subsidized uptake. What about the actual uptake in the public? To me, this also raises just the price point of eating a guidelines type diet. They talk about protein floor and moving away from shelf stable refined grains. They're making a massive assumption that the American consumer can't afford to participate. If you got time to prep, quote, real food and a budget for 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day of high quality animal protein, like you're in the club. Whereas most vulnerable populations are in low socioeconomic status brackets, these guidelines don't look like a map at all. They look like a wall. Now, the previous MyPlate guidelines, it was estimated that this would cost about $1,200 a month for a family of 4. That's the previous guidelines, right? Would definitively be cheaper than these current guideline recommended foodstuffs. The food budget, on the other hand, for the average middle income family in America is $518 a month. For low income, it's $322 a month. This is a budgetary crisis. Protein, animal sources in particular, that the prices are forecasted to rise. Plant product prices have been relatively stable price-wise. Also, ironically, legumes are incredibly cheap.
Yeah, 100%. There's a lot of specialized niche or unique scenarios that are not addressed here. They're just like fundamentally excluded or not recognized. And that's honestly where skilled dietitians are so valuable, is by recognizing and having solutions and ways to improve the nutrition and health of these selected situations that people have, maybe socioeconomic in nature, maybe medical in nature. And you're right that many of them are just not at all addressed by the guidelines. You're just kind of like out of the club, unfortunately.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks for playing. And then finally, again, probably your favorite part of this entire podcast. No one follows the guidelines. Researchers often use this metric called the Healthy Eating Index to measure adherence to dietary guidelines. On a scale from 0 to 100, the average American score has hovered around 56 to 58 for decades. Interestingly, since about 1999, these Healthy Eating Index scores have actually improved slightly, eating slightly more whole fruit and fewer empty calories, just a little bit. Yet obesity and metabolic disease have increased significantly since that time frame. Data shows, on average, only about 10% of the population follows the guidelines with any consistency. Now, this is based on like surveillance data from questionnaires. They're not like following people around and like, oh, you ate that. So this is self-reported, by the way. It's probably like the physical activity guidelines. It's probably half that, if that. So maybe 5% charitably. For the other 90 or 95%, the guidelines are just background noise in a food environment that's screaming at them to eat more and eat stuff that's not on the food pyramid anyway. So like, I don't know how many millions of dollars were spent to formulate this thing, but like the two potentially good things compared to the bad and the ugly, I'm like, feels like that money could have been better allocated. Like an exercise promotion one. If RFK Jr. and the Maha movement was like, we got to exercise and we're going to take all this money and do this, we might not agree with the implementation, but we'd find a lot less to be like, look, and you did this wrong too, I think.
Yeah. I have little else to add at this point beyond, pay attention to the trends, the trajectories, the outcomes, adjust for the impact of, biomedical innovation, science, GLP-1 agonists, things like that. And then be prepared to change your opinion if things do not go in the direction that you expect in the coming years to decades. That's a long enough time horizon that, by the time it becomes abundantly clear whether this is working or not, people will have forgotten this saga anyway. So I continue to lack a great deal of optimism on that front either. But I wish that there was more kind of intellectual honesty, logical consistency. There's other areas of these guidelines that, for example, criticize the use of observational data in one realm while heavily leaning into observational data in another realm. And so just the logical incoherence and inconsistency of it, I think, is what is probably most frustrating, because I know it's not going to get better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's some argument here that these guidelines are kind of a form of policy lip service. By providing this like what to eat framework, the government places the entire burden of health on individual choice. Like if you get sick, the government can say, well, look, we told you to eat all the protein and avoid the ultra-processed foods. It's not our fault, your fault. This, of course, ignores the upstream policies that dictate what food is available. And the new food pyramid doesn't fix the farm bill. It just changes the educational advice. Educational, doing a lot of heavy lifting in that phrasing. So, Austin, we're looking at a nearly $100 billion policy shift here. But when we look at the HEI scores, we see that the average American is basically failing a nutrition test every single day. Is the new food pyramid actually designed to change the American diet, or is it just a political rebrand that allows the government to look busy while the underlying food environment, the subsidies and the ultra-processed food availability, remain completely untouched?
I don't actually know that the underlying food environment is going to be completely untouched. It may be the case that some incentives change, realign. There might be some food reformulation. I hope not, but maybe even to more align with some of this stuff of like, there's some of these restaurants, like you look at, I think it was Shake Shack or something that said like now 100% beef tallow based fries and stuff like that, or Steak and Shake. Sorry. Don't sue us, whoever I said the first time.
I'll cut that out.
And so there's some impact on things. It's just hard to predict what the impact is going to be when historical uptake of these guidelines has been relatively poor. You're right that, as we've talked about on our last podcast as well, the availability of calories and the way that those calories are packaged and delivered, our surrounding food environment, dictates way more of our routine, habitual food-related behaviors and our eating behaviors, much, much, much more than any graphic, any guideline, any label that's slapped onto the side of a cereal box or milk carton, as we learned when we were kids too. And so this is ultimately a bit of a shrug for me. I think that there's just a lot of moving parts here between guidelines, how that impacts policy, the biomedical space, and like our best attempts to fight back against these things. We're like trying to hold back the doors with, our meager tools like, tirzepatide and things like that. So ultimately where it all shakes out is going to obviously remain to be seen. And then, in another 5 years, who knows who's going to be in power, writing these guidelines, designing these guidelines, and we might be, back to square one again.
Yeah, I'll be curious if there's any impact on these new guidelines, the new food pyramid, on that, big food trial that we talked about in the last podcast. Is like, do they enter this as evidence? Like, look, even the government admits this is problematic. That would be interesting, and the subsequent downstream effects from that, or even upstream, like as far as policies related to subsidized crops and such. But then there's more complicated food insecurity, so on and so forth. To me, I don't know. This is maybe a little more hokey, so you can roll your eyes if you like, or maybe you agree. I think if you put the American public in a room, you somehow got them all in a room, and you said, look, what do we agree on with respect to nutrition? Everyone would agree, look, if you live here, you should have the opportunity to eat a health-promoting dietary pattern. We want our food supply to generally be healthy. We don't want too many restrictions because this is the land of liberty, so we want to be in charge. But we also want our basic food supply and water supply and everything else to be healthy, especially for children and vulnerable populations. I think everybody would be on board for that. There might be one straggler who's like, nah, make it unhealthy. It's like the South Park, writers, for example.
I think you're less likely to have people who say, no, make it unhealthy, but more so people who are like, no, I'm not willing to pay for it to be healthy.
That's
way
it's hard
more
how you
common.
achieve that, and
Yes.
that's where people would start to disagree. But if this food pyramid came out and was like, look, we want everybody to have the opportunity to eat a health-promoting dietary pattern. Here's how we think that should be laid out, and here's how we're going to do about it. Yeah, people would disagree perhaps on the implementation, but there's this opportunity for like cohesion and unification. Like, look, we're all in this together. Let's work together. But instead they chose violence. They're like, nah, we're going to lean into this like heavily meat focused thing. We're going to make some strange choices about saturated fat intake and ignore, mountains of research on fiber and legumes and such like that. Just seems like missed opportunity. And also like one mention about exercise. I don't know. It just could have done better. That to me is, we could have done better.
I mean, always could do better. These things are going to continue to evolve with time. I think, whether this ends up being a more consistent trend or whether this ends up being a blip kind of depends on, how we vote in a couple of years. So TBD.
TBD. All right. So what I did, we've talked about the, new food pyramid and old food pyramids and everything else. I thought, well, what if we were tasked with coming up with our own version of a dietary guideline, Like, no, we don't have a multi-million-dollar budget to recruit the best interdisciplinary team available to help us out. Then again, the new food pyramid seemed to ignore most of their experts anyway, so we could just be in the clear. Instead, we've taken the latest evidence surrounding dietary practices and boiled it down to the Barbell Medicine Dietary Guidelines for Americans, particularly adults. Our philosophy is pretty simple. Dietary behavior isn't a matter of willpower, it's an emergent process. It happens when your genetics and your subconscious appetite regulation collides with the food environment that's been engineered to be frictionless. So, a few points here. First off, we're starting with energy and the environment. This needs to be a reality check. Again, this is an emergent process, like how much food we eat. And so we need to the extent it's possible, to modify our microenvironments. What happens at home, what happens at the office, so on and so forth. We would like to make those foods rich in either minimally processed foods or processed foods that don't have added sugar in them or are hyper palatable, very tasty, and have a lot of calories. To the extent we can do that, that would be awesome. We would also want to make sure that folks are eating in a way that's not distracted. So no screens at the table. And oh yeah, by the way, ideally eat at a table if you can. We think that should result in a better amount of energy intake or calorie intake by default, meaning that you don't have to weigh and measure every single thing, log everything into an app. But if you wanted a calorie target, there are opportunities and resources for that. We have our own calorie calculator you could use if you want. For protein, 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight per day is fine. That can go up to 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight. That's fine for most. It could be higher if you train hard or if you prefer a higher protein intake. Nothing really bad is going to happen. It's just going to cost more money. And further, where we deviate from the new food pyramid is that the source doesn't really matter as much as the total number. We do agree you should prioritize lean protein, particularly unprocessed sources. So chicken breast, fish, legumes, Greek yogurt, tofu, etc. And we would lean heavily into more plant-based proteins, particularly because the fiber intake also relatively cheap comparatively.
Mm-hmm.
Next, moving on to fruit and vegetable. The current guidelines say, look, get at least 3 servings of vegetables and 2 servings of fruit per day. We wouldn't disagree with that. We would just say, try to have more if you can. And it doesn't matter if it's frozen or fresh, just have more and vary them as much as possible. We want folks to target at least 30 to 40 grams of fiber per day, which I think is another thing missing from the current guidelines. Just put it out there. It's a number, but some people would be interested in seeing that. Other thing to include here is that whole fruit is better than fruit juice. You could blend it if you want to, because that preserves the fiber, but juicing removes the pulp. It can be frozen fruit as well if you want to do this. For carbohydrates, 2 rules of thumb that Austin talked about in our recent fiber action plan, both comparing the grams of carbohydrates to the grams of fiber. And those 2 ratios are 5-to-1 and 10-to-1. If a food has a ratio of 5-to-1 grams of carbohydrates to grams of fiber, that makes it an elite choice. We're talking about things like lentils, raspberries, non-starchy vegetables. If a carbohydrate source has 10 grams of carbohydrates to at least 1 gram of fiber, that is acceptable. Likely a processed food or a starchy carbohydrate, both of those can help you meet your health goals. For fat intake, we would recommend to reduce the fat intake from red meat and also butter, also beef tallow, if we're being explicit here.
Yeah.
If someone is looking for a numerical target, it would be less than 10% of total calories from saturated fat. you don't need to micromanage and specifically count milk or yogurt if you don't want to. In fact, I think most people shouldn't be micromanaging their saturated fat intake. We would also advise to limit dietary cholesterol if you're at high risk for heart disease, and focus on increasing the intake of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats from like olive oil, fish, nuts, etc., ultimately to reduce the risk of heart disease. With respect to ultra-processed foods, we would agree with the current guidelines to limit them, particularly foods with added sugar. So you can look on the label for syrups, things that end in OSE, and so on, particularly liquid foods that have added sugar, like sodas, for example. So soft drinks, also sweetened cereals, instant soups, frozen pizzas, check out the label. On the other hand, we disagree that people should inherently limit non-nutritive sweeteners, especially when we're talking about liquid foods. So replacing sugar-sweetened beverages like sodas with the diet versions can be useful, but ultimately, we're going to keep coming back to the same thing. Your diet probably shouldn't be that sweet overall. Moving on to alcohol and sodium, I think the recommendation of limiting alcohol intake to 1 to 2 standard drinks per day or abstain is fine. It increases the reward value of food, provides non-filling or non-satiating liquid calories. So you'd want to balance that against any perceived benefits. But ultimately, if somebody's not drinking already, I don't think that there's a health benefit to starting drinking. And generally speaking, less alcohol is better. For sodium intake, we would recommend to attack this by reducing intake of ultra-processed foods, especially those that have a lot of sodium in them. That's the primary source of excess sodium in the diet, as well as an increased calorie intake. So you come at it from both of those ends, eating less calories overall based on a better dietary pattern that defaults to a more correct energy intake, and also reduction in ultra-processed food intake reduces sodium intake. That doesn't apply to athletes. Their sodium needs are highly variable, and that's outside of what would be the dietary guidelines for Americans. That'd be dietary guidelines for athletes, for example. We have a hydration podcast we can refer you to on that. And finally, for supplements. Now, you're like, look, these are dietary guidelines for Americans. Why the heck are you talking about supplements? Come on, man. Well, look, 75% of Americans take dietary supplements every year. It's a $35 billion a year market. We want to make sure that people are doing so responsibly. So a few things. One, you'd want to make sure that your supplement that you're taking is third-party tested. The biggest sort of players in the space are NSF, Informed for Sport. That's who we use. USP. This is going to be on the label somewhere. If it's not on the label and you still have questions, you can search these databases to make sure that they are third-party tested. You'd also want to make sure that your supplement is certified for current good manufacturing processes. Should also be on the label. It appears as a CGMP sort of shield type thing most of the time. And then after meeting those two criteria, there should be good evidence for not only safety, but as well as efficacy. Does it do the thing that you're taking it for? If a supplement meets all of those, we're probably in favor of you doing so if you want to spend the money. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what your perspective is here, not a lot of supplements fit all those. Yeah. So your supplement bill would be maybe less than you think. But on the other hand, if you own a supplement company, you probably didn't like that section.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's my similar take on, the approach to supplements is like there should be a concrete benefit that I'm looking for that for some reason is applicable to me. And I want to feel confident that it is going to deliver that to me and that it is going to be safe in doing so. And I don't know, there are very, very few supplements that meet those criteria. I even kind of shrug at taking creatine myself, and not much more beyond
your
that.
Brain health.
Yeah, sure.
Totally. Come on. Totally. How are you so smart without creatine?
There are certainly, some supplements that have maybe some more benefit for unique scenarios that don't necessarily apply to me that, I'd be open to discussing with somebody on a case-by-case basis. But, overall, these guidelines are reasonable. I think that they reflect a lot of how you and I both tend to eat. I would say, more plants, more training, less sugar, less alcohol. Yeah. Might be an even simpler way to distill things down for a lot of people that would have like a net benefit on population health. I would feel more confident that if I said like those 4 things, that there'd be a bigger shift in population health if they were to uptake it than by leaning harder into beef tallow. But that's my hot take for this one.
Big bean energy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as we wrap this up, I'm struck by a sense of deja vu. In the 90s, we were given a map that ignored the biological reality of refined grains because it was more convenient for the economy. Now we're being given a new map that corrects the protein error, but seems to ignore the reality of lipidology, fiber, and food practices of the American public in general, all while creating division in the public. The reality is that the new food pyramid is mostly the same. It's mostly fine, and it likely won't change how people eat in America. Now, Barbell Medicine, our guidelines are born from the existing evidence base and our experience in the field. We focus on things that actually move the needle if people were to do them. So things like environmental mastery, a protein recommendation that supports muscle and training, a fiber to carb ratio that protects the gut, and a P to S ratio that guards the heart. Now, if you want to take a deeper look at the Barbell Medicine Dietary Guidelines, we've put together a comprehensive resource on our website that will be available soon. It'll be in the show notes as soon as it's ready. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with a friend or a family member. The best way to combat a rigged food environment is through community and shared evidence. While you're there, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps drive traffic to our podcast so we can keep bringing you all the latest nuance in health and fitness. Special shout out to Dr. Austin Baraki for joining us. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. We'll catch you next week and every week.
This is the new Weight Watchers. It works for members like Jojo, who's learning simple, healthy habits, Sharia, who's making progress with meds, and Kim, who still gets to eat what she loves. For over 60 years, we've helped millions of members find what works for them. Now, it's your turn. Watch your life open up. Watch your story shift. Watch what you're capable of. Watch it work. Get started today at WeightWatchers.com.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.